Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Del Sueño al Podio, From Dream to Podium, the podcast where we remember, learn, and recognize the most important athletes and sporting events in history. I'm Daniel Uriega, and we tune in every Wednesday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and also on YouTube. As you've already read in the title, today we're talking about one of the most controversial figures in the history of sports, one of the most famous cyclists, the man who seemed to have everything to be one of the greatest athletes ever seen, Lance Armstrong. With his incredible feat of 7 victories in the Tour de France, Armstrong became a symbol of overcoming adversity after beating advanced testicular cancer. However, his legacy was tainted by a doping scandal that forever changed the perception of his career. After inspiring millions, he ended up being one of the most controversial names in sports. I think all of us who were born before the 2000s know exactly how he was, even if it's just because we bought his famous yellow Livestrong wristband. They say that a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth, and Lance defended his lie from day one in 1999. Lance Armstrong was born on September 18, 1971, and was raised in Plano, Texas by his mother, Linda. A young mother working as a receptionist. Lance never knew his father, by the way. Lance started sports at 12, although he initially practiced triathlon. His transition to road cycling happened around the age of 16, and he fully dedicated himself to the sport. His mother didn't have much money, so Lance thought about making money, but without taking loans. The good and bad here was the pressure and the hunger to make money. He was the youngest competitor. He loved competing with the best and loved winning. As a kid, he would argue with one of his coaches, often saying, "Damn, you're not my dad." And then he would say it to everyone else, with his high school friends too. He was the typical guy who'd say, "You're not the boss of me." From 1993 to 1995, he was young and one of the best cyclists, making good money and thinking about dedicating himself to it for a while and then seeing what else came up. But that later came much sooner than expected. Lance Armstrong was diagnosed with testicular cancer in October 1996 when he was just 25. The diagnosis was quite severe. The cancer had advanced. His testicular cancer was the size of a lemon. Lance explains that testicular cancer spreads throughout a young person's body, climbing up to the abdomen and the lungs, and the last stop is the brain. Lance ignored the symptoms for a long time: severe headaches, blurry vision, coughing up blood, and severe pain in his testicles. In 1996, Lance had the cancerous testicle removed and underwent experimental treatment in Indiana. The doctors gave him less than a 50% chance of survival. They operated on his brain to remove cancerous lesions and started chemotherapy that wouldn't affect his lungs. His goal was to return to cycling. The side effects were brutal, and the hair loss, the weight loss, but if he survived, the treatment would protect his athletic career. The first surgery to remove the testicle was huge. It was a 15-centimeter incision all the way to his waist and physically very painful. After several rounds of chemotherapy, Armstrong managed to overcome cancer and was declared free of the disease in early 1997. But it wasn't an easy process, as in addition to the physical and emotional suffering, he also had to deal with anxiety of an uncertain future and the side effects of the treatment, which affected his strength and endurance. So, as soon as he could, he got back on his bike and rode around the streets where he lived. It was an important day for him, though he didn't push it too much. It was just about 1 kilometer, literally like any normal person. He had on sneakers and a mountain bike. But for him, it was like a victory. Just sitting on the bike, pedaling, feeling the wind on his face, and especially that feeling you get when you're a kid and you go out to ride your bike because it makes you feel free. Once he recovered from cancer, Armstrong decided to return to professional cycling. He thought no one would believe he could do anything, that he was finished, and Lance set his sights on winning the Tour de France. Before we dive into the races, it's important to know that the Tour de France is one of the toughest sporting events out here. It covers 3,500 kilometers over 3 weeks. The 21 daily stages includes float roads, brutal climbs, and the time trials. Each day within the group of the cyclists known as the peloton, the rider with the best time wears the yellow jersey. Every time in the Tour has 9 cyclists, but only the team leader races for the yellow jersey. The other cyclists are domestiques, which means servants in French. But one important role of the domestiques is to protect the leaders from the wind, because when you're going fast on flat terrain, the wind has a huge effect, so the cyclists at the front work up to 36% harder than those protecting in the back. Even at high speeds, you often see domestiques from different teams working together to combat the wind. But anyway, in 1999, Lance Armstrong arrived at the Tour de France with the Postal Service team. No one expected anything from them. They were very young. They didn't even have a proper truck. It was a very small team that traveled in those RVs, the ones with families they use for vacations. But they dominated the Tour and changed cycling. Lance crushed the competition. The story kept growing and growing, becoming even more beautiful, but some experts started having doubts as they observed the whole situation. Everything looked too good to be true, but in 1999, the organizers of the Tour de France were desperate, needing a refresh to reconnect with the public. In 1998, when Lance was coming back to cycling after cancer, the Tour de France was brutal, and the best team of the time, Festina, had a masseuse attending for them. And when French customs stopped him, they found a shipment of drugs. The police investigated other teams, and everywhere they found were drugs. But Lance came back a year later and simply became the sensation. At the same time, there were people laughing and unable to believe that a former cancer patient like Lance could attack the mountains and supposedly compete without doping. Pedaling was less effort than the others, with more power and even faster than in all the previous tours. It didn't make sense. Armstrong wasn't considered someone capable of winning the Tour de France because his strength was in short races, not long ones. He had never been a climber, meaning he wasn't someone who could handle the climbs like those in this competition. Remember how the organizers wanted to reconnect with the people? Well, by 1999, they wanted the race to be slower than previous ones to show that these cyclists were using fewer drugs, or none of them. It ended up being the fastest tour, but with the most romantic figure the sport had ever seen. A cancer survivor returns to the sport and wins the Tour de France. With Lance's victory, the market in the United States opened up in a huge way. Oakley, Nike, Trek, Bristol-Myers Squibb, and several other brands wanted to make deals with Lance Armstrong, a survivor and spokesperson for cancer survivors. His first win in 1999 was the last time he was just a cyclist. After the fame came and he became a celebrity, it gave him a lot of power. In fact, in 1999, Lance almost had his act fall apart. They found steroids in his urine. Armstrong said he was using a cream for what they call seed irritation, a cortisone cream that, according to Lance Armstrong, everybody used for a bruise, blister, or any skin infection. According to him, the traces in the test were so small. The UCI, the International Cycling Union, which governs cycling, issued a statement saying it goes against the medical confidentiality policy, but they wanted to clarify this before things go out of control. They confirmed that the use of the cream and that the cyclist showed a prescription before the test. Heinberg Bruggen, president of the UCI from 1991 to 2005, appeared in the test done on Lance and told Johan Armstrong's team director, that he needed to give them something to justify this. People searched the internet for something that contained that type of cortisone and found a cream that had it. And that's why they say it was for irritation. It's worth noting that out of the 7 Tour de France victories he had, all of the riders who made it to the podium, only one wasn't involved in doping. The biggest challenge of the Tour de France, the hills of the Maritime Alps, it's the ultimate test of energy and endurance. A climb in the mountains can mean climbing 30 kilometers. Lifting a person and riding a bike demands an enormous amount of energy, greater than any other animal, except for the hummingbird. It stresses the body in unnatural ways, and this causes athletes to seek doping methods to reduce pain and surpass their own limits. It's said that doping has always existed, and in the early days, in the tour, it was alcohol. The monks in the mountains would pass beers around, and who could say no after all the effort, the heat, and now imagine it's ice cold, even less so. But the cyclist would stop to find anything to drink, wine, beer, booze, and if nothing else was available, well, water it was. But over time, doctors started coming to the tour and said they could prepare them for the race with drugs like food, or for the knockout hits, they'd inject EPO to make them 10% better than their rivals. 10% is a huge difference. EPO is a hormone that produces red blood cells, which carry oxygen in the blood. Cheating athletes use it to gain more endurance, allowing them to recover faster and either feel less or not feel fatigue at all. It doesn't strengthen your muscles or give you more energy. You don't feel anything at all, simply the sensation of fatigue, burning, or thinking you can go any further, it's delayed. And this started to be seen in the 90s. The Italians were the first. In a small town in Italy, there was a group of doctors dedicated to improving cyclist performance. The most notorious one was Armstrong coach, Michele Ferrari. He was a doctor who would create a planned program to boost your career and make you the king. He had a very bad reputation. He was the doctor who could set you up with a doping program. Michele was obsessed with extending the athletic limits of a man. After Lance's cancer, Ferrari turned his weakness into an advantage. He was lighter, he lost a lot of muscle and strength, so he shifted the load from his muscles to his heart, lungs, and blood. And if you have an aerobic engine to handle a higher cadence, you can go faster and longer. The cadence in cycling refers to number of times the pedals turn in a minute, that is revolutions per minute, and it's used to assess the cyclist's physical condition. So Lance started using these drugs to improve his performance in races. Ferrari wanted to avoid detection of his doping trick. He had sources in labs that would warn him about new tests. It said that Michele traveled in an RV and he lived in it on the outskirts of Milan near the highway and a gas station. Who visits their doctor like that? It wasn't normal. But how did Lance manage to pass the tests? The average lifespan of EPO in the body is 4 hours, so he simply played with the timing. By 2001, there was a trial against Michele Ferrari. Filippo Simeoni, an Italian cyclist, was a star witness. Filippo had documented everything in detail about his relationship with Ferrari. In October 2004, the Italian court convicted Ferrari of sports fraud, forcing Armstrong to publicly end his relationship with him. But Ferrari's conviction was overturned 2 years later. Armstrong's stance was doping had been around for 100 years in his sport. I came in and the rules were already set. I just joined in. Well, if they can do it, why can't I? Before 1999, there were huge risks with doping. You could go to jail if you got caught with it. So Lance found a way around him. He found someone to help him move it, his gardener. They called him Moto Man. I don't think it needs much explanation. This guy He did the Tour de France on his motorcycle and was in charge of meeting with someone from the staff to make the delivery in a very subtle way in a restaurant. It's important to note that at that time, there were no EPO doping tests. By 2000, they developed an EPO test. So the smart ones like Ferrari turned to a technology that simply involved taking blood bags before the race and then reinfusing them during the competition. So during the race, the blood is craving red blood cells. A transfusion increases the red blood cells, and unlike EPO, it's almost impossible to detect in blood transfusions. In 2000, Ferrari told Armstrong that the test for detection was almost ready, so he recommended not using EPO during the tour. They agreed to just do one transfusion, and they did it halfway throughout the tour. In 2004, they faked the mechanical failure, parked the team bus, and injected blood into all the team's competitors. So literally, right in front of everyone, the police, the fans, with all of them outside the bus. When everyone cheats, the competition changes and it becomes a power game. Who has the best doctor? Who has the most money? Who can manage the most risk? The best at all of this at the time was Lance Armstrong. Armstrong had already accepted and normalized cheating. In fact, he even had this attitude that if you're going to cheat, you might as well do it right. Train 100%, have a team to improve 100%, and if it's doping, go 100% with that too. When you have that kind of mindset and apply it to a sport with no regulations or rules, where people do blood transfusions, take drugs, and use all their power to avoid detection, that's when the sport turns into something much darker. In fact, in 2004, Armstrong sued the authors of La Confidencial, the first book, to accuse him of doping. He halted its publication. He halted his publication in the US, forced an apology, and won a lawsuit for $1.5 million, which tainted the reputation of his co-author, David Walsh. By 2005, Lance had won 7 consecutive tours, but how did Lance manage to dope so much without getting caught? Well, thanks to the UCI, the International Cycling Union, the highest governing body of cycling worldwide. The president during Lance Armstrong era was Hein Verbruggen, and they were always friends. Lance himself admitted that he got calls from the UCI telling him he was very close to getting caught, but money was what kept everyone silent and on the same page. They were making a lot of money. The bicycle brand Trek had 100 million in 1998, and then it was reaching 1 billion. But when the newspaper L'Equipe published evidence of Armstrong's doping, it became a problem for cycling. So Verbruggen asked a contact, Vryman, to investigate the newspaper's claims. He urgently needed to know how to respond to the article about Armstrong. The report didn't focus on whether Lance had doped. It mainly went over technical details of laboratories and attack to anti-doping agency without examining any drug samples. The report totally exonerated Armstrong, and they recommended the UCI not legal action. In 2007, the UCI paid the final bill of the report, about 100 grand. And the same year, it turned out Armstrong had made the same donation to the UCI for the same amount. But according to the UCI, it was to pay for a blood testing machine purchased in 2005. Years went by, Lance had retired and gotten away with it again and decided to come back. But why did Lance come back in 2009 to convince people he'd never doped? No, he just had the guts to come back and win cleanly. It was probably a way for him to prove to all his critics and himself that it didn't matter that he had doped before. Floyd Landis, Lance's ex-teammate, was so pissed because he had been suspended for doping, came back and was called a cheater, while Armstrong was treated like a hero. Floyd's resentment would be key to Lance Armstrong's downfall, so thought that his Livestrong campaign and foundation were simply a front to cover up his doping in the sport. It was 2004 when the famous Livestrong yellow wristbands were sold. I think everyone born before the 2000 was part of this fundraising campaign for cancer research. They were sold for $1 each, and all the money raised went to research, prevention, and support for people with cancer. Just like the Whoop nowadays, where tons of athletes and even people who don't work out wear them just to be in the hype. At least the Livestrong bands were for a good cause. The Livestrong Foundation had raised over $300 million for cancer victims, and more than 100 million wristbands were sold worldwide. It was a phenomenon. At the end of the day, the gap between being a hero and the reality of his actions really pissed people off. Lance thought that because he raised so much money, helped so many people, and given hope to so many, it justified what he had done. 2 months before the Tour de France, he competed in the Giro d'Italia as a final warm-up to test himself clean against the best in the world on his way to France. Lance took a step back and fell behind the top riders. He didn't perform well, and obviously at that level he wouldn't hope to win in France. In June 2009, UCI officials went to his house in Aspen, Colorado to conduct another anti-doping test, the 31st one, including both blood and urine. The next day, USADA, the US anti-doping agency, showed up for test number 32. Everyone wanted to test him, the Cycling Federation, the US Olympic Federation, and more. 1 month before the Tour de France, he started training in Aspen with his teammate from Astana, Levi Leipheimer. Training at high altitudes played the role in doping. Cyclists train in the mountains to produce more red blood cells like EPO. They would take 1 or 2 bags of blood and then transfuse them during the tour. So Lance, during mountain training, would do some tests at specific kilometers to measure his blood levels and take notes, just as Ferrari had recommended. Lance had claimed that he cut ties with Ferrari in 2004, but Italian police discovered that Armstrong had been in contact with Ferrari through his son Stefano. In the mails, they found Papa Ferrari was Schumi, and they asked about an outstanding payment of 25,000 euros. Banks confirmed the payments to Ferrari. Once again, Lance lied, justifying that he didn't know who else to trust for his training. But no, once a cheater, always a cheater. Even Lance himself had admitted that Ferrari was the first to tell him not to take any risks because they had Armstrong in their sights. They wanted to catch him. Ferrari supervised Lance's progress from Italy, comparing his performance with the previous month, including that he had improved 10% in watts per kilogram. His best score was 6.5. The best number Lance had ever achieved was the last year he won the Tour in 2005 with more than 7. So comparing the 7 years he had won, they thought that with a 6.5 he could still win the Tour if he didn't make any mistakes, fall, or something like that. After saying he would retire after his 2005 win, Lance Armstrong returned to race in the Tour de France in 2009. From the very first stage, Lance wanted to prove something. In the past, he had dominated the time trials, so an impressive race would show that he had returned. His time put him in first place for 30 seconds, but the best competitors were yet to race. One by one, including his teammate Alberto Contador, who won the Tour in 2007, all of them beat Lance's time. Armstrong finished 10th in the first stage, 40 seconds behind the leader and 22 seconds behind his teammate Contador. Despite being teammates, Lance and Contador didn't speak each other, practically ignoring each other in their pass, if they passed by. In Astana, Armstrong and Contador were competing for the team leader role. In stage 3, using domestics, Lance found a way to use the wind in his favor when they passed the seaside and the crosswinds with the peloton. Remember, the peloton is a group of riders riding together. The crosswinds split the peloton, and Lance, along with 2 domestics, moved ahead. The rest of his teammates, including Contador, stayed behind. Lance wanted to take advantage and anything that could help him win the Tour. They finished 41 seconds ahead of the peloton, which helped Lance move from 10th to 3rd place, beating his teammate Alberto Contador by 19 seconds. So Lance's return was starting to seem believable. Back then, if you doubted or didn't believe in Lance Armstrong legend, you were practically wrong. People hated those who didn't believe and questioned his achievements. Here, it's important to mention Frankie Andreu, a former teammate of Lance and his wife Betsy, who was also a good friend of Armstrong. For the 2009 Tour de France, Frankie and Betsy had fallen out with Lance, and Frankie, now working as a reporter, was tasked with interviewing Armstrong. In fact, Lance looked for that interview. But why did they fight and stop being friends? These two played a crucial role in Lance Armstrong's fall. So, before resuming the race, the team Astana had a meeting to define some details about who would take the leadership, Lance or Alberto. Alberto or Lance, not even them knew. The only thing for sure was that they wanted to win, and during the race, one of the two would have to step forward. During the race, Lance and Contador were neck and neck when Alberto looked over at Lance to see what was going on, to check if they were staying equal or if one of them would take the lead. That's when Contador just started pedaling and showed the superior level he had over Lance Armstrong. Lance was obviously questioned about whether he could come back, about Contador's high level, and the Armstrong we used to know, the one who defended himself and simultaneously attacked with his answers, was now different. He seemed calmer, acknowledged the level of the others, and simply admitted he wasn't in a condition to fight for the victory. Despite that, Lance still wanted to fight and aimed to stay in the top positions. For many, Lance's return without finishing first, or at least on the podium, would be disappointing, and above all, a failure for him. So, Johan, the team director, tried everything possible to get Lance on the podium and asked Contador to maintain in the pace he was going, because if he accelerated and attacked, it would force the Schleck brothers to do the same and thus push Lance further from the podium. In the final mountain stage, after the team trial, Contador remained in first place in the Tour, and Lance managed to secure third, just a few seconds ahead of Wiggins and Frank Schleck, and only 1 minute behind Andy Schleck. Even knowing he wasn't going to win the Tour de France, Lance Armstrong managed to excite everyone at the race's end. He fought until the very end, kept the necessary pace to reach the podium, inspired everyone, even those who doubted him. And the newspapers that once criticized him also acknowledged and applaud the Texans' performance. It was that fairy tale that ended with a great conclusion. And although he finished third, for him and the people, it felt like a victory. Mainly for Lance, for all he had generated since his first win, doing it clean, according to his own words, for all the people who supported him, cancer survivors, and the families who benefited. But 4 years later, something strange was discovered in Armstrong's blood from 2009. During the Tour, Lance's red blood cells should have decreased, but they increased several times before his return to the race. Armstrong swore he hadn't doped, that he had done that Tour clean. But who would believe him after so many lies? His return to the Tour de France wasn't the fresh start he thought, but rather the beginning of the end. In 2010, Lance competed again in the Tour de France and finished 23rd place. Contador won the race but was disqualified for doping. After his return in 2009 and competing in 2010, Armstrong's enemies slowly started to emerge. The first was his former teammate Floyd Landis, who claimed to have seen Lance doping for races. Another was Jeff Nowitzki, a lead agent and investigator in the fight against doping in sports, none other than the one who prosecuted Barry Bonds. That's a good chapter, by the way. And as a part of FDA, Food and Drug Administration, he was investigating Armstrong. Nowitzki slowly began to break down the case. Armstrong's team was sponsored by the US government, so he focused on things like possible money laundering, possibly transferring controlled substances, tax evasion, bribing officials, whatever it took to get to the doping point. Cyclists were called to testify one by one. As the investigation continued, another athlete was disqualified for doping, so Tyler Hamilton, Lance's teammate in 1999, started considering his options. In 2011, Tyler knew that the Armstrong lie was too big and would eventually come out, so he told his story and admitted that he had seen Lance inject himself with EPO. That year, Armstrong announced his retirement from competitive cycling again in February at 39 years old, with the intention of focusing on his family and his cancer-fighting foundation. At the beginning of 2012, an election year, the Department of Justice surprised everyone by announcing they wouldn't press charges against Armstrong, but the USADA, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, continued the investigation. Travis Tiger, the CEO of USADA, with federal help, obtained 26 detailed testimonies from Lance Armstrong's teammates, Landis, Wouters, Hamilton, Andreu, and the one that hit Lance the hardest, his friend George Hincapie. But they approached Hincapie and told him, "Buddy, if you cooperate, we'll give you just 6 months. If not, you're banned for life." In October of that year, USADA formally charged Armstrong with use, possession, and trafficking of banned substances, banning him from cycling for life and stripping him of all his sporting achievements from August 1998 onwards, including his 7 Tour de France titles and his 3rd place in 2009. His sponsors and Livestrong cut ties with him. In those months, while Lance was going through hell and still refusing to admit he had doped, Armstrong began calling some friends to offer apologies and ask them if he should confess. Lance gathered his courage and decided to speak out. In January 2013, Lance gave an exclusive interview to Oprah Winfrey, where he finally admitted to having competed under the influence of doping for all his Tour de France victories between 1999 and 2005. Of course, he lost all his fans. Just because everyone breaks the rules doesn't mean it's okay. He deceived so many people, cancer survivors, reporters, sponsors, even those of us who didn't follow the sport but were moved and captivated by the story, the legend of Lance Armstrong. Lance's story earned him a fortune of over $125 million. In 2013, the US government and the Floyd Landis sued Armstrong for defrauding the US Postal Service. Although Armstrong didn't admit to breaking the law, he agreed to pay a fine of $5 million and accepted responsibility for defrauding the US government by using banned substances while racing for the Postal Service team. For the rest of his life, Armstrong is banned from competing in sports governed by the World Anti-Doping Agency. After the Armstrong case, cycling authorities, especially the UCI, intensified efforts to detect doping. More advanced technologies were implemented to detect banned substances, and the frequency of testing was increased, both in competitions and during training. Stricter sanctions were also introduced for offenders. And so we end this chapter from Dream to Podium with one of the most controversial figures in the history of sports. One of those characters who makes you question what success is and what cost it is achieved. His victories, which inspired millions of people around the world, were overshadowed by a doping scandal that changed his legacy forever. Armstrong went from being an undisputed hero to a controversial figure. I hope you enjoyed, were moved, entertained, and maybe even learned a little about cycling and Lance Armstrong. Please help us out. If you liked it, subscribe, hit the like button, turn on notifications, and comment on which other athlete or sports event you would like us to talk about here. See you next Wednesday. I'm Dan Uriega. Let's go. Woo!